Before we begin tonight's journey into one of the Bible's most overlooked blessings, I want to ask something that would mean the world to me. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel grow in ways you possibly couldn't imagine, and it allows me to continue bringing you these stories week after week. If you're listening over on Spotify, leaving a review genuinely makes such a massive difference. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. It creates this amazing global community of people seeking truth, mystery, and peace in these stories. And of course, if you enjoy what you hear tonight, subscribing to the channel ensures you never miss another deep dive into the stories that shaped history, faith, and the human experience. Now let's talk about something powerful. Let's talk about a blessing so unexpected, so undeserved, that the man who received it wasn't even looking for it. There are moments in history when something sacred pauses, not because God withdraws, not because the blessing ends, but because people become afraid to move forward. Fear has a way of freezing progress. It halts celebration. It turns joy into anxiety. And sometimes in those moments of collective paralysis, God finds someone who isn't looking for glory, someone who simply says yes when everyone else is saying no. Tonight's story is about one of those people, a man whose name most Christians have never heard, a man who wasn't a prophet, wasn't a priest, wasn't royalty. He was simply available. And in his availability, he discovered something profound, that God's presence, when honored rightly, doesn't bring destruction. It brings blessing beyond measure. This is the story of Obed-Edom, a man who became a footnote in Scripture, but whose quiet faithfulness reveals one of the most beautiful truths about how God works. Sometimes the greatest blessings come not to those who chase them, but to those who simply open their doors when everyone else has locked theirs. Let's begin with a celebration that ended in tragedy and a journey that stopped in the most unexpected place. Chapter 1. The Ark returns. The city of David was alive with anticipation. After years of waiting, after generations of separation, the Ark of the Covenant was finally coming home. King David had united the tribes, conquered Jerusalem, and now sought to bring the very presence of God into the heart of his new capital. This wasn't just a religious ceremony. This was the culmination of David's vision for Israel, a nation centered not on military might or political power, but on worship, on the presence of the living God dwelling among his people. The preparations had been extensive. 30,000 chosen men from Israel gathered for the occasion. Musicians practiced their instruments. Singers rehearsed their songs. The streets were decorated, and the atmosphere was electric with expectation. The ark itself carried profound significance. This wasn't merely a religious artifact. According to the accounts passed down through generations, this wooden chest overlaid with pure gold represented the very throne of God on earth. Inside it lay the stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna from the wilderness, and the staff of Aaron that had budded miraculously. But more than its contents, the ark represented something Israel had lost, the manifest presence of God. Years earlier, the ark had been captured by the Philistines during a disastrous battle. Though it had been returned after bringing plagues upon its captives, it had never made it to Jerusalem. It had remained in obscurity in the house of a man named Abinadab in a town called Kiriath-Jearim. Now David was bringing it home. The day of the procession arrived with perfect weather and perfect enthusiasm. The ark was loaded onto a new cart built specifically for this purpose. Uzzur and Io, sons of Abinadab, guided the cart. They had grown up in the house where the ark resided, and they were familiar with its presence. David and all Israel celebrated before the Lord with all their might. The sound of lyres, harps, tambourines, sarums, and cymbals filled the air, and the king himself danced before the ark, leading his people in worship. This was supposed to be the greatest day in Israel's recent history. The procession moved slowly and deliberately. Every step was meant to be savored. This was a moment of national unity, spiritual renewal, and royal triumph. David had planned everything perfectly, or so he thought. Chapter 2. A Sudden Tragedy. The road from Karath Jm to Jerusalem was not particularly long, but it was uneven in places. The cart carrying the ark moved carefully along the path, surrounded by celebration and song. Then at a place that would later be remembered as the threshing floor of Nason, something went wrong. The oxen stumbled. Whether they hit a stone, lost their footing, or simply faltered under the weight, the ancient texts don't specify. What matters is what happened next. The cart lurched, the ark shifted, and in that moment, instinct overpowered instruction. Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark. It was a completely natural response, the kind of thing anyone would do when something precious is about to fall. His hand touched the gold-covered wood, and immediately he fell dead beside the cart. The music stopped. The singing ceased. The celebration died in an instant. One moment, 30,000 people were rejoicing. The next, they stood in a stunned silence, staring at a body lying beside the Ark of God. David's reaction was complex. The ancient text says he was angry. Angry at what had happened. And angry at the disruption of his perfect plan. Angry at God for what seemed like a harsh and inexplicable act. But beneath the anger was something deeper. Fear. Pure, overwhelming fear. How could this happen? Uzzah had grown up around the ark. He had lived in the same house with it for years. His intentions were good. He was trying to protect it, to keep it from falling. And yet, in the instant his hand made contact, he died. The theological questions were immediate and disturbing. If the very presence of God could strike down someone trying to help, how could anyone approach it safely? How could it be moved at all? David had planned this as the crowning achievement of his reign, and now it had become a scene of death and confusion. The king stood there watching his vision collapse. This was supposed to be a triumphant entry. Instead, it was a funeral. The people looked to him for answers, for direction, for some explanation of what had just occurred. He had none to give. In that moment, David made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue. He couldn't bring this ark into Jerusalem, not after what had just happened. The risk was too great. The fear was too real. Whatever blessing the ark was supposed to bring, the cost seemed too high. The journey stopped right there in the middle of the road, with Jerusalem still miles away. The procession halted. The greatest religious celebration in recent memory ended in tragedy and terror, and David faced a question he hadn't anticipated. What do you do with the presence of God when you're too afraid to receive it? Chapter 3. The ark is stopped. David stood at the threshing floor, his mind racing through possibilities and problems. The ark couldn't go back to where it came from. That would be an admission of complete failure. But it couldn't continue to Jerusalem either. Not now. Not like this. The fear was too fresh. The death too recent. The confusion too profound. The king asked a question that echoed with both fear and honesty. How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? It wasn't rhetorical defiance. It was genuine confusion. He wanted the presence of God in his city, but he had just witnessed that presence kill a man who simply touched it. The paradox seemed impossible to resolve. The decision had to be made immediately. The ark couldn't remain on the road. It needed shelter, protection, a temporary home while David figured out what had gone wrong and how to proceed safely. But who would take it? Who would be willing to house something that had just demonstrated such terrifying power? The ancient records don't tell us how the choice was made. Was there a discussion? Did someone volunteer? Was a house simply chosen because of proximity? What we know is this. Nearby lived a man named Obed-Edom. He was a Gittite, meaning he came from Gath, one of the Philistine cities. He was part of the community, but not native-born Israelite royalty. He had no particular fame, no special status, no recorded acts of heroism or prophetic calling. He was simply a man who lived near the place where the procession had stopped, and his house became the solution to David's problem. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israelite religion, was carried off the road and placed in Obed-Edom's home, not as an honor, but as a necessity, not because he was chosen for blessing, but because someone had to take it and his house was available. One can only imagine what Obed-Edom thought when he was told the ark would be staying with him. Did he see it as a privilege or a death sentence? Had he witnessed what happened to Ususa? Did he know the stories of what had befallen the Philistines when they captured the ark years earlier? The Philistine cities had been ravaged by plagues when they possessed the ark. Tumors broke out among the people. Rats infested their land. The ark had moved from city to city, each one desperate to get rid of it, until finally they sent it back to Israel on a cart pulled by cows with golden offerings to appease the God of Israel. And now that same ark was in Edom's house, the same presence that had struck down Ususa, the same object that had brought plagues to Philistine cities, sitting in his home with his family for an indefinite period of time. David returned to Jerusalem without the ark. The celebration was over. The plans were abandoned. And somewhere in an ordinary house in the care of an ordinary man, the presence of God waited. 3 months would pass before anyone checked on what was happening there. 3 months of silence, 3 months of the unknown. But in that silence, something extraordinary was occurring, something no one expected, something that would eventually change everything. Chapter 4. Introducing Edom. Let's pause and consider who this man actually was. In the grand narrative of Scripture, Edom appears suddenly, serves his purpose, and then fades into the background. Most people reading through 2 Samuel skip right past his name, but his brief appearance tells us something important about how God works. Edom was not from the priestly line. He wasn't a Levite born into the service of the tabernacle. His name suggests Edomite heritage, and the text explicitly identifies him as a Gittite. Gath was one of the 5 major Philistine cities, famous as the hometown of Goliath. Whether Obed-Edom was ethnically Philistine or simply lived among them is unclear, but what's certain is that he wasn't part of Israel's religious elite. This detail matters. The ark was supposed to be carried by Levites, handled by priests, approached with specific rituals and protocols. The law given to Moses contained explicit instructions about how the ark should be moved, who could touch it, and what precautions were necessary. David had ignored these instructions by placing the ark on a cart, copying the method the Philistines had used to return it years earlier. Now, ironically, the ark ended up in the house of a man from that same Philistine region. God's presence, rejected by the king of Israel out of fear, found temporary residence with someone outside the traditional religious system. Obed-Edom had a household. The text mentions his family later, indicating he had sons who would eventually serve in the temple. He was a working man, probably a farmer or tradesman. He lived a quiet life in a small community on the road between cities. Nothing about his background suggested he was destined for any role in Israel's history, but he had something that mattered more than credentials. He had a home, and he was willing to receive what others feared. When the ark was brought to his house, Edom faced a choice. He could have refused. He could have pointed to his non-Israelite background, his lack of priestly training, his reasonable fear of what had just happened to Ususa. He had every logical reason to say no, but he didn't. Whether from faith, duty, or simple obedience to authority, he accepted the responsibility. The ark was placed in his home, and life continued. The sun set that first evening with the ark under his roof. His family went to sleep that night in the same house as the presence of God, and they woke up the next morning still alive. That first day became a second day. The second became a week. The week became a month. And slowly, quietly, without any public announcement or religious ceremony, something began to change in that household. Chapter 5. 3 quiet months. The text gives us almost no details about those 3 months, no dramatic visions, no angelic appearances, no miracles recorded for posterity, just this simple statement. The ark remained in the house of Edidon for 3 months, but the absence of detail is itself significant. Silence in Scripture often means normal, routine life continuing as it should. Imagine those first days. The morning after the ark arrived, Edin probably woke up half surprised to still be breathing. He had seen what happened to Susa. He knew the stories of the Philistine plagues. Every morning that he and his family survived must have felt like a small miracle. But as days turned into weeks, something became clear. The ark wasn't there to destroy them. Whatever had gone wrong with Ususa, whatever had caused that sudden death, wasn't happening in Udam's house. They went about their daily routines. They worked their fields, prepared their meals, lived their lives, and the ark simply rested there in whatever room they had designated for it. There was probably a reverence in that household, a care taken not to treat the ark casually, but there was also, gradually, a comfort. The presence of God, honored properly, wasn't something to fear. It was something that brought peace. The ancient text doesn't tell us if Udden prayed before the ark, if he worshiped there, if he made offerings. We don't know if he talked about it with his neighbors or kept quiet about the sacred object in his home. What we know is that he treated it with the respect it deserved, maintained his household in righteousness, and let God be God in his home. And slowly, changes began to appear. Not dramatic, not obvious at first, but real, tangible, measurable. The kind of changes that neighbors notice, the kind of prosperity that raises questions. His fields began to flourish, whether it was the crops growing more abundantly, the livestock thriving, or both. The productivity of his land increased noticeably. In an agricultural society where everyone's yields were roughly similar, exceptional harvests stood out. People noticed. His household grew more harmonious. Conflicts that might normally arise in any family seemed to resolve more easily. There was peace under his roof. Visitors commented on the atmosphere. Something felt different about his home. His children seemed to thrive. They grew healthy and strong. Whatever blessings flow from a godly household seemed to multiply in his family. Later records show that his sons would go on to positions of service in the temple, suggesting they grew up in an environment that shaped their character positively. And financially, everything seemed to work. Projects succeeded, investments paid off, debts were cleared. The kind of comprehensive household prosperity that makes people wonder, what changed? What secret you're holding? What advantage you've gained? But Ode Eden wasn't holding a secret or working an angle. He was simply living with the presence of God in his home. And that presence, rather than bringing the curse everyone feared, brought blessing in every area of his life. 3 months of quiet faithfulness. 3 months of treating the sacred with reverence. 3 months of simply being willing to house what others were too afraid to receive. And in that time, an unknown man became a walking testimony to a profound truth. God's presence brings blessing to those who honor it. Chapter 6. The Unexpected Blessing. Word travels in small communities. When one household suddenly begins to prosper in every measurable way, people notice, neighbors talk, visitors observe, and eventually news reaches those in authority. The reports that made their way back to David were striking. Udam's household was flourishing, not just surviving, but thriving. Everything he touched seemed to succeed. His family was at peace. His resources were multiplying. His entire household was blessed. And the blessing was directly connected to one thing. The ark of God was in his house. The same ark that had brought death at the threshing floor. The same presence that David had been too afraid to bring to Jerusalem. The same object that had caused plagues in Philistine cities. In Edom's house, it brought nothing but blessing. This created a profound theological moment for David. The problem hadn't been the ark. The problem hadn't been God's presence being inherently dangerous. The problem had been the improper handling of that presence, the disregard for God's specific instructions about how the ark should be moved and who should carry it. David began to research. He consulted the law. He spoke with priests and Levites, and he discovered what had gone wrong. The ark was never supposed to be on a cart in the first place. That was how the Philistines had returned it, but it wasn't how God had commanded Israel to transport it. The Levites were supposed to carry it on poles inserted through rings on its sides. See, specific families had specific duties regarding its care and movement. Uzzah's death wasn't arbitrary divine anger. It was the consequence of approaching holy things in unholy ways. The reverence that should have been shown from the beginning had been replaced with expediency, an imitation of pagan practices. God's presence requires God's protocols. Blessing comes through obedience, not casual approach. But Edom, intentionally or not, had shown proper reverence. He had treated the ark with respect. He had maintained righteousness in his household. He had honored the presence of God, and God had honored him in return. The contrast was stark and instructive. A king with all the resources of Israel had approached God's presence carelessly and experienced tragedy. A common man with no credentials had received that same presence with reverence and experienced comprehensive blessing. The lesson was clear. God's favor isn't determined by status, but by attitude, not by position, but by posture. David heard these reports and something shifted in him. The fear that had paralyzed him 3 months earlier gave way to understanding. The confusion about how to approach God's presence resolved into clarity. He knew what had to be done. He knew how to do it correctly. And most importantly, he was ready to try again. But this time, there would be no shortcuts, no copying of pagan methods, no dismissal of God's specific instructions. This time, if the ark was to come to Jerusalem, it would come the way God had prescribed from the beginning, with Levites carrying it, with proper sacrifices, and with worship that honored not just God's presence, but God's procedures. Edom had done more than house the ark. He had demonstrated something David needed to see, that God's presence is safe when God's ways are honored, that blessing isn't withheld from those who approach the holy with proper reverence, that even someone outside the traditional religious establishment could experience God's favor by simply treating sacred things as sacred. The 3 months had served their purpose. They had been a pause in the journey, yes, but they had also been a lesson, a demonstration, a proof that the problem wasn't God's desire to bless his people. The problem was his people's failure to approach him correctly. Now David understood, and he was ready to finish what he had started. The ark would come to Jerusalem, but this time, everything would be different. Chapter 7. News reaches the king. The reports that reached David's palace were consistent and compelling. Messengers from the region around Edom's house all told variations of the same story. The household was blessed, remarkably, comprehensively, undeniably blessed. And the blessing had begun exactly when the ark arrived. David must have felt a complex mixture of emotions hearing this news. Relief that the ark hadn't brought destruction to another household. Vindication that God's presence was meant to bless, not curse. But also, perhaps, a twinge of regret. 3 months of blessing had gone to someone else's house. 3 months of God's manifest presence had been in a small home on the outskirts of his kingdom rather than in his capital city where he had planned to house it. But more than any personal feelings, David saw opportunity. The pause had served its purpose. The question that had paralyzed him, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me, now had an answer. It could come through obedience, through proper protocol, through reverence combined with joy. David assembled his advisors, priests, and Levites. He explained what had happened and what he had learned. The ark was to be moved again, but this time according to God's explicit instructions. The Levites from the families of Kohath, who were designated to carry the holy objects of the tabernacle, would bear the ark on their shoulders using the poles designed for that purpose. No cart, no shortcuts, no improvisation. Sacrifices would be made, not as appeasement for past mistakes, but as worship offered in proper sequence. Every 6 steps, the procession would stop and offerings would be made to God. The journey wouldn't be rushed. It would be deliberate, reverent, and filled with worship at every stage. David also made personal preparations. He would dance before the ark again, but this time wearing a linen ephod like a priest, identifying himself not primarily as king, but as a worshiper. The celebration would be even greater than the first attempt, but the approach would be fundamentally different. Joy combined with reverence, celebration grounded in obedience. Word was sent to Obed-Edom. The ark would be leaving his house. The 3 months had ended. The presence of God was moving to its intended destination. For Obed-Edom, this must have been bittersweet news. The blessing of those months had been extraordinary. His household had experienced prosperity unlike anything before. But the ark had never been meant to stay permanently. It had always been passing through. The day arrived for the ark to continue its journey. David came personally along with priests, Levites, musicians, and a crowd of worshipers. The atmosphere was different from that first attempt. There was still joy, still celebration, still music and dancing, but there was also a reverence that had been missing before, an understanding that they were handling something holy, something that required specific protocols, something that demanded respect. The Levites lifted the ark onto their shoulders. The poles rested on their shoulders as God had prescribed. They began to walk, and after 6 steps, the procession stopped. Sacrifices were offered, worship was given, and then they continued. 6 more steps, another sacrifice, more worship. The journey that had been interrupted by death now continued, marked by worship at every stage. David danced before the ark with all his might. The text emphasizes his complete abandon in worship. This wasn't dignified royal ceremony. This was uninhibited joy, a king celebrating not his own power, but the presence of God among his people. The same David who had feared the ark 3 months earlier now celebrated its presence with everything in him. The procession moved through the countryside toward Jerusalem. People lined the route. The sound of trumpets, singing and shouting filled the air. This time there was no stumbling, no death, no fear, just the steady progress of God's presence moving toward its rightful place in the center of Israel's capital. And somewhere in that crowd, probably near the front, given his recent role, was Obed-Edom. His part in the story was ending, or so it might have seemed. The ark was leaving his house. The extraordinary season of blessing was transitioning to something else. But his story wasn't over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. Chapter 8. The journey resumes. The second attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem succeeded in ways the first could never have matched. Yes, the ark reached its destination, which was the practical goal. But more importantly, the process itself became an act of worship that taught Israel something profound about approaching God. Every 6 steps, the procession stopped. Bulls and fattened calves were sacrificed. The smell of burning offerings filled the air. Prayers were lifted. Songs were sung. And the journey that might have been completed in hours took much longer because worship was integrated into every stage. The destination mattered, but so did the journey. Getting the ark to Jerusalem was the goal, but getting there correctly was equally important. David's dancing was legendary. The text describes it as dancing with all his might. This wasn't a few dignified steps. This was a king completely lost in worship, unconcerned with royal dignity, focused entirely on honoring God's presence. Later, his wife Michal would criticize him for it, saying he had disgraced himself by dancing so freely before the people. David's response revealed his heart. He was willing to become even more undignified than this in his worship of God. The musicians played with skill and passion. Trumpets, harps, lyres, tambourines, sarums, and cymbals created a sound of celebration that could be heard throughout the region. This wasn't background music. This was a symphony of worship, a concert of praise, a declaration through sound that God's presence was returning to dwell among his people. As the procession entered Jerusalem, the entire city came out to witness the moment. From the youngest children to the oldest elders, people lined the streets. The ark moved through the city streets, carried on the shoulders of Levites, surrounded by worship, headed toward the tent David had prepared for it on Mount Zion. Finally, the ark reached its destination. It was placed inside the tent. More sacrifices were offered. Burnt offerings and fellowship offerings were presented before the Lord. And then David did something remarkable. He blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty and gave gifts to everyone present. Men and women alike received portions of bread, dates, and raisins. The king celebrated God's presence by generously blessing his people. The ark was home. The journey that had started months earlier, that had been interrupted by tragedy and delayed by fear, was complete. God's presence now dwelt in the heart of Jerusalem, in the city David had established as Israel's capital. The physical and spiritual centers of the nation were now aligned. But the story doesn't end there, because woven into the fabric of this triumph was the quiet faithfulness of a man who had made it all possible, a man who had bridged the gap between fear and faith, a man who had demonstrated that God's presence brings blessing when properly honored. Chapter 9. Edom's lasting legacy. In the biblical narrative, many people appear briefly and then vanish from the record. They serve their purpose in the story and disappear back into history. Edom could have been one of these people. His role was over. The ark had left his house. The blessing he experienced during those 3 months could have been the entirety of his legacy. But that's not what happened. Later passages of Scripture reveal that Edom's story continued, and in a beautiful way. He didn't return to obscurity. Instead, he was brought into service at the very center of Israel's worship. First Chronicles records that Edom and his sons became gatekeepers for the sanctuary. This wasn't a minor position. Gatekeepers controlled access to the sacred spaces. They ensured that those who entered were supposed to be there and that they approached with proper reverence. They protected the holy from the profane, the sacred from the common. It was a position of significant trust and responsibility. Think about the symmetry of this. A man who had faithfully guarded the ark in his home for 3 months was now entrusted with guarding the sanctuary where the ark resided. His private faithfulness became public service. His quiet obedience became recognized ministry. The text also records that Edom's sons served alongside him. 68 of his descendants are mentioned in Chronicles for serving in various capacities related to the temple and its worship. The blessing that began when the ark entered his house extended through generations. His faithfulness created a legacy that outlasted him. And this wasn't about Edom seeking position or reward. Nothing in the text suggests he asked for this role or campaigned for recognition. Rather, David recognized what God had already revealed, that Edom was a man who knew how to honor God's presence, that he understood reverence, that he could be trusted with sacred things. The man from Gath, the outsider with no priestly lineage, became part of Israel's ongoing worship. His house had been blessed. Now his service would be a blessing to others. The presence that had dwelt in his home temporarily became the focus of his life permanently. There's something profoundly encouraging about this outcome. Edom didn't perform miracles. He didn't receive prophetic visions. He didn't conquer enemies or write scripture. He simply said yes when the ark needed a place to stay. He honored what was holy. He maintained righteousness in his household. And from that simple obedience flowed blessing that extended far beyond those 3 months. His story reminds us that God sees faithfulness even when no one else is watching. That obscure obedience matters. That the way we handle what God entrusts to us, even temporarily, reveals our character and positions us for future service. Edom could have complained that he was being burdened with a responsibility he didn't ask for. He could have resented that his house was chosen out of necessity rather than honor. He could have worried about the risk rather than embracing the opportunity. Instead, he simply received what God placed in his care and honored it appropriately. And that choice, that simple, faithful choice, transformed his family's trajectory for generations. And the blessing wasn't just material prosperity during those 3 months. The blessing was becoming part of something larger, something eternal. His name is written in Scripture. His faithfulness is recorded for all time. His descendants served in God's house, all because he opened his door when others were closing theirs. All because he said yes when fear would have prompted no. All because he honored the presence of God rather than fearing it. Epilogue. When God dwells with the willing. The story of Edom sits quietly in Scripture, easily overlooked between the larger narratives of King David's triumphs and failures. But within its brief telling lies a truth that echoes through every generation. God's presence brings blessing to those who receive it with reverence. Consider the progression of this story. It begins with celebration turned to tragedy. A well-meaning man dies for touching what he shouldn't have touched. Fear replaces joy. The journey stops because no one knows how to proceed safely. The presence of God becomes something people fear rather than desire. Then comes a man no one would have chosen, someone from the margins, someone with no credentials or special calling, someone who was simply available when opportunity or responsibility knocked on his door. He receives what others feared. He houses what others rejected. And in his faithful obscurity, he experiences blessing that reaches the king's attention. Finally, the journey resumes. But now it's different. Now there's understanding. Now there's proper reverence combined with joyful worship. Now the protocols are followed. And God's presence reaches its intended destination, not despite the delay, but perhaps because of it. The 3-month pause with Edom wasn't a failure of David's plan. It was part of God's plan. A demonstration, a lesson, a testimony. What can we learn from this ancient story? Perhaps this, that God is less interested in our rumas than our willingness, that he honors humble obedience more than impressive credentials, that his presence transforms ordinary households into blessed households when received with reverence. Edom didn't seek the ark. It came to him. He didn't ask for blessing. It flowed from honoring what was entrusted to him. He didn't campaign for recognition. It came as a natural result of faithfulness. His entire legacy began with a simple act of receiving what God placed in his care and treating it with proper respect. There's encouragement here for anyone who feels ordinary, overlooked, or outside the circles of influence and importance. God's greatest blessings often come to those who aren't seeking the spotlight, but are simply faithful in the shadows. The house that receives God's presence with reverence becomes the house God blesses, regardless of its size, status, or location. There's also a warning here. The same presence that blessed Obi struck down. The difference wasn't God's mood or arbitrary preference. The difference was the approach. Sacred things require sacred handling. God's presence is a blessing when honored and a danger when treated casually. Reverence isn't optional, it's essential. But perhaps most importantly, in this story reminds us that God's plans aren't derailed by our failures or delays. David's fear and confusion didn't stop God's purpose. The 3-month pause didn't prevent the ark from reaching Jerusalem. Instead, that pause created an opportunity for an unknown man to be blessed and for all Israel to learn a crucial lesson about how to approach the holy. Sometimes what looks like delay is actually preparation. Sometimes what feels like failure is actually education. Sometimes the detours teach us what the straight path never could. Edom's house was blessed because he was willing to receive what others feared. His legacy extended beyond his lifetime because he was faithful with what he was given. His name is remembered because he said yes when yes was costly and uncertain. The question for us isn't whether we'll have opportunities to house God's presence in some literal physical way. The question is whether we'll receive what God places in our care, whatever form that takes, with the reverence it deserves. Whether we'll honor the sacred in the midst of the ordinary, whether we'll be faithful in obscurity, trusting that God sees and honors quiet obedience. God often blesses the homes willing to receive him quietly, not the ones seeking recognition, not the ones demanding explanation, but the ones that simply open their doors and say, "Whatever you bring, Lord, I'll honor it." That's the legacy of Obadam. That's the lesson of his story. And that's the invitation extended to every person in every generation to be the kind of dwelling, literal or metaphorical, where God's presence feels at home, where reverence and faithfulness create the conditions for blessing, where ordinary obedience leads to extraordinary grace. The ark eventually left Adam's house, but the blessing it brought never truly left. It marked his family for generations. It changed his destiny. It wrote his name into sacred history. All because when God's presence needed a home, he was willing to provide one. May we all have the courage to open our doors when others are closing theirs. May we have the faithfulness to honor what God entrusts to us. May we have the wisdom to recognize that his presence is not something to fear, but something to receive with joy and reverence. And may we discover, as Edom did, that when God dwells with the willing, blessing flows in ways we never imagined possible. Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I hope your day has been filled with blessings and peace. Whether it's morning where you are, the quiet of afternoon, or the gentle embrace of evening, know that you are exactly where God wants you to be in this moment. I'm curious about where in this beautiful world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled in your bed in a bustling city, or perhaps finding solace in the countryside under a canopy of stars? Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, you are welcomed here with open arms. If this story touches your heart tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber. We gather here regularly to explore the profound truths and timeless wisdom found in God's Word, bringing comfort to weary souls and strength to troubled hearts. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these sacred stories that remind us of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. Now let us journey together to ancient Israel, to a time when kingdoms stood at crossroads, when truth was a dangerous commodity, and when one man's courage would echo through the ages. This is the story of Micaiah, the forgotten prophet who dared to stand alone. The sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient city of Samaria, its golden rays dancing across the limestone walls of King Ahab's palace. Within those walls, power brooked no opposition, and truth was often the first casualty of political ambition. It had been 3 years since the last war between Israel and Syria, 3 years of uneasy peace that sat heavy on King Ahab's shoulders like an ill-fitting crown. Ahab paced the marble floors of his throne room, his royal robes rustling with each agitated step. The king of Israel was a man consumed by his desires, a ruler who had long ago traded his soul to the altar of self-interest. His marriage to the foreign princess Jezebel had brought prosperity to his kingdom, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The worship of Baal had infiltrated the very heart of Israel, and the prophets of the Lord had been hunted, killed, or driven into hiding. Yet today, something stirred within Ahab's ambitious heart. News had arrived that morning of Syrian movements near Ramoth Gilead, a strategic city that had once belonged to Israel, but now languished under enemy control. The city's location made it a prize worth fighting for, a gateway that could secure trade routes and strengthen his kingdom's eastern border. As Ahab contemplated this opportunity, word came that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was approaching Samaria with a considerable entourage. Jehoshaphat was everything Ahab was not, a king who sought the Lord's face, who had torn down the high places of idol worship, and who ruled with righteousness as his compass. The irony was not lost on Ahab that he would need the help of such a man to achieve his ambitions. The great doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant boom, and Jehoshaphat entered with the dignity befitting a king of David's lineage. He was a man of medium stature but commanding presence, his beard meticulously groomed and his eyes holding the wisdom of one who had walked closely with the Almighty. Behind him came his advisors and military commanders, and their expressions respectful but cautious as they entered the domain of Israel's controversial king. "Jehoshaphat, my brother," Ahab called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber as he descended from his throne. "Welcome to Samaria. Your presence brings honor to my house." The two kings embraced in the customary greeting, though those who knew them well could sense the underlying tension. Jehoshaphat had come seeking alliance, but his heart was troubled by what such an alliance might require of him. "Ahab," Jehoshaphat replied warmly, though his eyes remained watchful, "it has been too long since we have spoken face to face. The Lord has blessed both our kingdoms with peace these past years." "Indeed," Ahab agreed, gesturing toward the laden tables his servants had prepared. "Come, let us feast together and speak of matters that concern us both." The banquet that followed was a spectacle of royal excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. Musicians played softly in the background, while servants moved like shadows, attending to every need. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, both kings harbored their own purposes. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues, Ahab finally revealed his true intention. Leaning toward Jehoshaphat with the conspiratorial air of old friends, he spoke in measured tones. "My brother, there is a matter that weighs heavily upon my heart," Ahab began, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us, yet it remains in the hands of the king of Syria. Should we not take back what is rightfully ours?" Jehoshaphat set down his goblet carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ahab rarely extended hospitality without purpose. The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implication. "Ramoth-Gilead has indeed been a source of contention," Jehoshaphat replied diplomatically. "What do you propose?" Ahab's smile was that of a merchant who senses a favorable negotiation. "I propose that we go up together against Ramoth-Gilead. Your army combined with mine would be formidable. We could restore the city to Israel and share in the glory of victory." The words were carefully chosen, appealing to both practical strategy and Jehoshaphat's sense of brotherhood among the tribes of Israel. Yet Jehoshaphat had not survived as king by making hasty decisions. His reign had been marked by careful consultation with the Lord, and he would not abandon that practice. "Now I am as you are," Jehoshaphat responded slowly. "My people as your people, my horses as your horses. If the Lord wills it, we shall stand together in battle." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of true conviction. "But first, let us inquire of the Lord." Ahab's smile faltered slightly. In his eagerness for military glory, he had hoped to avoid the complications that divine consultation might bring. Yet he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from a potential ally, especially one whose righteousness was renowned throughout the region. "Of course," Ahab agreed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "Let us seek the word of the Lord." What followed was a demonstration of the spiritual corruption that had infected Ahab's court. The king summoned his prophets, all 400 of them, men who wore the garments of holiness, but whose hearts served earthly masters. They came in a great procession, their robes flowing and their voices raised in what appeared to be spiritual fervor. These were not true prophets of the Lord, though they claimed his name. They were court prophets, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended upon telling the king what he wished to hear. Their prophecies were crafted not in the secret place of prayer, but in the calculating chambers of political expediency. As the prophets assembled in the courtyard before the two kings, their spokesman stepped forward. His name was Zedekiah, son of Chinana, a man whose pride matched his ambition and whose hatred for true prophets would soon be revealed in violent fashion. "Hear the word of the Lord," Zedekiah proclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical intensity. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." The 400 prophets took up the cry with orchestrated precision, their voices creating a chorus of false assurance. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." Some of the prophets had even prepared visual aids for their performance. They danced and shouted, waving swords and spears, creating a spectacle that would have been impressive to any observer unfamiliar with the ways of true prophecy. The din was tremendous, the enthusiasm seemingly genuine, and the message exactly what Ahab longed to hear. Yet as Jehoshaphat watched this display, his spirit grew troubled. Something about the performance felt hollow, manufactured. These men spoke with one voice, but it was not the voice of the Lord that Jehoshaphat knew from his own times of prayer and seeking. There was no cost to their prophecy, no challenge to the king's desires, no hint of the divine complexity that marked true encounters with the Almighty. As the prophets continued their enthusiastic proclamations, Jehoshaphat raised his hand for silence. The courtyard gradually quieted, though the echo of their shouts seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides these?" Jehoshaphat asked carefully, "that we might inquire of him?" The question fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembly. Ahab's face darkened, and several of the court prophets exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew there was indeed another prophet, one whose very existence was a thorn in the flesh of everyone present. Ahab's response came through gritted teeth, his voice barely concealing his irritation. "There is still one man, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord. But I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil." The honesty of Ahab's admission was startling in its nakedness. Here was a king openly declaring his hatred for a prophet, based not on any moral failing or false prophecy, but simply because the man refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. It was a moment that revealed the true spiritual state of Israel's leadership. Jehoshaphat, ever the diplomat, sought to smooth over the awkward moment. "Let not the king say such things," he replied gently, though his words carried a subtle rebuke. Ahab realized he had revealed too much of his heart. With visible effort, he composed himself and called for one of his officers. "Bring Micaiah, at the son of Imlah, quickly," he commanded, though his tone suggested he would rather summon a plague upon his house. As the officer hurried away on his grim errand, the two kings settled in to wait. The 400 prophets remained in the courtyard, their earlier enthusiasm now tempered by the knowledge that their unanimous voice was about to be challenged by a single man they both feared and despised. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and in the distance the sound of the officer's horse could be heard galloping toward the place where truth dwelt in isolation, where a forgotten prophet waited in the shadows of his integrity. The horse's hooves struck the dusty road with rhythmic precision as the king's officer rode toward the humble dwelling where Micaiah made his home. The prophet lived simply, far from the luxury of the royal court, in a stone house that spoke of function rather than ostentation. Here, away from the corrupting influence of political power, dwelt a man who had chosen faithfulness over favor, truth over comfort. Micaiah, son of Imlah, was not an imposing figure by earthly standards. Of average height and lean build, he bore the weathered appearance of one who had walked through many storms. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the deep weariness of a man who had spoken unpopular truths for too many years. Yet there was something unbreakable in his demeanor, a quality that suggested he had found his anchor in something far stronger than human approval. When the king's messenger arrived, Micaiah was in his garden, tending to the vegetables that provided much of his sustenance. The prophet lived modestly, supported by the occasional gifts of those few souls who still valued truth above comfort. He had long ago learned to find contentment in simple things, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace of prayer, and the quiet joy of communion with the Almighty. "Micaiah," the officer called out as he dismounted, "the king commands your presence immediately." The prophet looked up from his work, unsurprised. He had sensed in recent days that the Lord was preparing him for something significant. His prayers had been marked by an unusual intensity, and his dreams had been filled with visions he did not yet fully understand. "Very well," Micaiah replied simply, setting aside his tools. "Let me wash and prepare myself." As Micaiah went about the task of making himself presentable for the royal court, the officer felt compelled to share information that might save the prophet from making a costly mistake. The man had witnessed what happened to those who crossed King Ahab, and despite his loyalty to the crown, he possessed enough humanity to feel concern for the solitary figure. "Listen to me, Micaiah," the officer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favorably." It was well-intentioned advice offered by a man who understood the political realities of Ahab's court. The officer had seen the 400 prophets deliver their unanimous message of victory and prosperity. He knew that Micaiah's reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. In his mind, he was offering the prophet a lifeline, a chance to align himself with the majority and avoid the consequences of standing alone. Micaiah paused in his preparations, considering the messenger's words. The offer was clear: conform, agree with the crowd, tell the king what he wants to hear, and enjoy the benefits of royal favor. It would be so easy, so practical, so utterly reasonable by every human measure. But as Micaiah looked into the officer's earnest face, he felt the familiar stirring of the spirit within him, that unmistakable presence that had guided him through decades of faithful service. The Lord had not called him to an easy path, but he had never failed to provide strength for the journey. "As the Lord lives," Micaiah replied with quiet dignity, "whatever the Lord says to me, so that I will speak." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of absolute commitment that left no room for compromise. The officer's face showed his disappointment and concern, but he knew better than to argue further. He had delivered his warning. What the prophet did with it was beyond his control. The journey back to Samaria was made in relative silence, the officer pondering the stubborn integrity of his passenger, while Micaiah prayed and prepared his heart for whatever lay ahead. As they approached the city, the prophet could see the banners of both Israel and Judah flying from the palace walls, confirming his suspicion that this summons involved more than a routine consultation. The palace courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Servants scurried about, preparing for what appeared to be an important gathering, while guards stood at attention in their finest armor. The 400 prophets were still present, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. Their earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more subdued attitude, though their confidence in their message remained unshaken. As Micaiah dismounted and followed the officer toward the throne room, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. Some looks were curious, others hostile, and a few held the barely concealed contempt of those who viewed his independence as a personal affront. He had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years, understanding that his very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of the spiritual compromise that permeated the court. The great doors opened before them, revealing the opulent throne room where Kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat waited. The contrast between the two rulers was immediately apparent, even to a casual observer. Ahab sat upon his throne with the restless energy of a man driven by ambition, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Jehoshaphat, seated in a chair of equal honor nearby, maintained the composed dignity of one accustomed to seeking divine guidance before making important decisions. "Ah, Micaiah," Ahab said as the prophet entered, his tone carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "At last our final consultant arrives." Micaiah approached the throne with measured steps, neither hurrying to show deference nor dawdling to display defiance. He had learned long ago that in the presence of earthly power, his allegiance belonged to a higher authority. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed respectfully, but not obsequiously, acknowledging the king's position without compromising his own integrity. "You summoned me, your majesty," Micaiah said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. King Jehoshaphat studied the prophet with interest. He had heard reports of Micaiah's reputation for uncompromising honesty, and after witnessing the theatrical performance of the 400 prophets, he was eager to hear from someone who might offer a different perspective. Ahab leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure before him. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" It was the same question that had been posed to the 400 prophets, the same inquiry that had produced such enthusiastic unanimity. Now it fell upon the shoulders of one man who stood alone, without allies or supporters, facing the combined expectation of two kings in their assembled courts. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. In the silence, Micaiah felt the familiar stirring of the Spirit. But what came first was not the word of the Lord, but something altogether unexpected. What happened next would be remembered and debated for generations to come. Micaiah, the prophet known for his uncompromising honesty, looked directly at King Ahab and delivered exactly the message the king wanted to hear. "Go up and prosper," Micaiah declared, his voice carrying throughout the throne room, "and for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled court. The 400 prophets exchanged glances of confusion and perhaps a touch of irritation. Here was the man they had feared would contradict their unanimous verdict, and instead he was confirming their prophecy word for word. Some of them smiled with what they imagined was vindication, while others seemed puzzled by this unexpected development. But King Ahab was no fool, despite his many moral failings. He had known Micaiah for years, had heard his prophecies of judgment and warning countless times. Never once had the prophet told him what he wanted to hear. Never once had Micaiah's words aligned so perfectly with royal desires. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the prophet's face, searching for the truth behind this suspicious compliance. There was something in Micaiah's tone, a subtle quality that suggested layers beneath the surface of his words. It was the same tone a parent might use when agreeing with a child's obviously foolish plan, allowing them to proceed while knowing full well what the consequences would be. King Jehoshaphat, too, sensed that something was amiss, though he remained silent, observing the interaction with keen interest. "How many times shall I make you swear," Ahab said slowly, his voice carrying a warning, "that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" It was a remarkable moment. Here was a king who had just received exactly the prophecy he desired, yet his own conscience convicted him that it could not be genuine. Ahab understood Micaiah well enough to know that such easy agreement was completely out of character. In demanding the truth, the king was inadvertently acknowledging that he recognized the difference between authentic prophecy and the comfortable lies he typically preferred. Micaiah stood silent for a moment, and those watching could see a visible change come over him. The sardonic expression faded from his face, replaced by the solemn countenance of one who was about to deliver a message from the throne room of heaven. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality altogether, the unmistakable authority of divine revelation. I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep that have no shepherd, Micaiah began, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. And the Lord said, "These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace." The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The vision was clear to everyone present. Israel would be defeated, their army scattered, and their king would not return from battle. It was a prophecy of military disaster and royal death, delivered with the calm certainty of one who had seen beyond the veil of earthly circumstances. King Ahab's face flushed with anger, but beneath the rage was something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to Jehoshaphat with the bitter satisfaction of one whose worst expectations had been confirmed. "Did I not tell you," Ahab said, his voice heavy with frustration, "that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" But Micaiah was not finished. The Spirit of the Lord had opened his eyes to see into the very council chambers of heaven, and what he had witnessed there needed to be shared, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he continued. "Therefore hear the word of the Lord," Micaiah declared, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a sword. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by on his right hand and on his left." The court fell absolutely silent. Even the most worldly and cynical among them recognized that they were hearing something extraordinary. This was not the political maneuvering they were accustomed to, nor the comfortable reassurances of the court prophets. This was a glimpse into eternal realities, a revelation of divine purpose that transcended human understanding. "And the Lord said," Micaiah continued, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, in that he may fall at Ramoth-Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, "I will persuade him." The Lord said to him, "In what way?" And he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Micaiah was claiming that the Lord himself had allowed, indeed had orchestrated, the deception that had been proclaimed by the 400 prophets. It was a divine judgment in the form of false prophecy, a spiritual trap set for a king who had repeatedly chosen lies over truth. Therefore, Micaiah concluded with inexorable logic, "Look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present was forced to grapple with the implications of what they had heard. The 400 prophets found themselves accused not merely of error, but of being unwitting instruments of divine deception. The kings faced the terrifying possibility that their carefully planned military campaign was actually a trap set by the Almighty himself. But the silence was short-lived. Zedekiah, the spokesman for the 400 prophets, was a man of considerable pride and ambition. He had built his reputation on his supposed connection to the divine, and Micaiah's words threatened not only his credibility, but his entire worldview. The accusation that he had been deceived by a lying spirit was more than he could bear. With a roar of rage, Zedekiah strode across the throne room until he stood face to face with Micaiah. The contrast between them was striking. Zedekiah in his fine robes and carefully groomed appearance, representing the comfortable religiosity of the court, facing Micaiah in his simple garments, embodying the uncompromising voice of authentic prophecy. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah demanded, his voice shaking with fury. It was a desperate attempt to challenge Micaiah's authority, to suggest that if anyone possessed a connection to the divine, it was surely the spokesman for 400 prophets rather than this isolated troublemaker. But before Micaiah could respond, Zedekiah's anger overwhelmed his judgment entirely. The sound of the slap echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Zedekiah had struck Micaiah across the face with sufficient force to stagger the prophet, leaving a red mark on his cheek that would serve as a visible reminder of what it cost to speak truth in the face of comfortable lies. The act of violence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. No one moved or spoke, shocked by the sudden transition from theological debate to physical assault. Micaiah slowly straightened, touching his cheek where Zedekiah's hand had left its mark. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for retaliation. Instead, there was a sadness that seemed to encompass not only his immediate situation, but the entire spiritual state of the nation. "Indeed," Micaiah said quietly, his voice carrying despite his gentle tone, "you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide." It was both prophecy and promise. The day would come when Zedekiah's false confidence would crumble, when the reality of divine judgment would force him to seek shelter from the consequences of his deception. The words carried the weight of inevitable fulfillment, spoken not in anger, but with the sorrowful certainty of one who had seen the future and found it tragic. King Ahab had heard enough. The prophet's words had struck too close to uncomfortable truths, had challenged too directly the comfortable illusions upon which he had built his reign. The vision of divine deception, the prophecy of military disaster, and the humiliating suggestion that his 400 prophets were unwitting instruments of judgment, all of it combined to create a rage that demanded immediate action. "Take Micaiah," the king commanded, his voice sharp with fury, "and return him to Amon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, the king's son, and say, 'Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace.'" The order was both punishment and insurance policy. By imprisoning Micaiah until his safe return from battle, Ahab was attempting to nullify the prophecy through royal decree. It was a desperate act of defiance against divine judgment, a futile attempt to bind the word of the Lord with chains and prison walls. But Micaiah was not finished. Even as the guards moved toward him, even as the shadow of imprisonment fell across his path, the prophet had one final word to speak. His voice rang out across the throne room with a clarity of absolute conviction. "If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." The words were a direct challenge to royal authority, a public declaration that put Micaiah's credibility as a prophet on the line. He was essentially saying that if Ahab returned safely from battle, then everyone present should conclude that Micaiah was a false prophet deserving of death. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in the word he had received from the Lord. But Micaiah was not content to let his challenge rest with the immediate audience. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers, nobles, and servants, he raised his voice even louder. Mark it all, you people." And it was a call to witness, an appeal to everyone present to remember this moment and test the validity of his prophecy against future events. The prophet was willing to stake everything, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life, on the truth of what he had spoken. It was a level of certainty that transcended human confidence and entered the realm of divine assurance. As the guards seized Micaiah's arms and began to lead him away, the throne room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Some whispered among themselves about the prophet's boldness. Others debated the implications of his vision, and still others tried to process the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. Through it all, the 400 prophets maintained their uncomfortable silence, uncertain how to respond to accusations that struck at the very heart of their prophetic claims. King Jehoshaphat watched the proceedings with deep concern. The righteous king of Judah had requested divine counsel, and what he had received was a prophecy that directly contradicted his military plans and predicted disaster for his ally. Yet something in Micaiah's bearing, some quality of authentic conviction, made it impossible to dismiss his words as the ravings of a madman or the spite of a disgruntled prophet. As Ma was led away, his footsteps echoing through the palace corridors, he felt no bitterness toward his captives or self-pity for his situation. He had spoken the word of the Lord faithfully, regardless of the consequences, and that obedience brought a peace that transcended his circumstances. The prison cell that awaited him might confine his body, but his spirit remained free, unanchored in the unshakable certainty that he had been faithful to his calling. The cell where Micaiah was imprisoned was a far cry from the luxury of the royal court. Built of rough stone, with a small barred window that provided minimal light, it was designed for punishment rather than comfort. The bread of affliction and water of affliction promised by the king proved to be exactly that. Meager rations calculated to sustain life while providing a constant reminder of royal displeasure. Yet in that dark cell, Micaiah found something that had eluded him in the freedom of his simple home: absolute clarity about his purpose and calling. Stripped of all earthly comforts and securities, he was forced to rely entirely upon his relationship with the Lord. In the long hours of solitude, he prayed not for deliverance, but for continued faithfulness, not for vindication, but for grace to endure whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for war continued with increasing intensity. King Ahab threw himself into military planning with the fervor of a man trying to drown out unwelcome voices of conscience. He consulted with his generals, inspected his troops, and made elaborate arrangements for what he was determined would be a glorious victory. The prophecy of the 400 court prophets was repeated frequently, as if constant repetition could somehow make it more reliable. King Jehoshaphat, however, found himself deeply troubled by the day's events. The contrast between the theatrical unanimity of the 400 prophets and Micaiah's stark authenticity had left him with serious doubts about the wisdom of the planned campaign. Yet he had given his word to stand with Ahab, and the political implications of backing out now were significant. As the day of departure approached, Ahab made one final attempt to circumvent the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. If the word of the Lord through Micaiah was true, then King Ahab was destined to die in battle. But perhaps, the king reasoned, he could outwit divine judgment through human cleverness. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," Ahab announced to his commanders. "But you put on your robes." It was a cunning plan. By dressing as an ordinary soldier, while Jehoshaphat wore royal garments, Ahab hoped to deceive the enemy about his identity and location. If the Syrians could not identify him as the king of Israel, perhaps he could survive the battle and prove Micaiah wrong. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had served Ahab well in political maneuvering. But he was about to discover that divine judgment operates by different rules than human conflict. The morning of battle dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Ramoth Gilead. It seemed an unlikely day for the fulfillment of prophecy, too beautiful for the tragic events that were about to unfold. The armies of Israel and Judah had assembled in impressive formation, their banners flying proudly in the morning air, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. King Ahab, disguised as a common soldier, moved among his troops with nervous energy. His royal armor had been replaced with the simple leather and bronze of an ordinary warrior, and his distinctive crown was nowhere to be seen. To any casual observer, he appeared to be merely another commander preparing for battle. Yet those closest to him could sense his underlying anxiety, the tension of a man who was trying to outrun a divine decree. King Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, wore his royal robes with obvious reluctance. The righteous king of Judah had agreed to this deception as part of their military strategy, but his conscience troubled him. The memory of Micaiah's words weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself offering frequent prayers for divine protection and guidance. The Syrian army was formidable, well-trained, and confident in their ability to defend their territory. Their king had given specific instructions to his 32 chariot commanders. Fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. It was a strategic decision based on the understanding that killing or capturing the enemy king would effectively end the battle and secure victory. As the two armies faced each other across the field of battle, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Horses stamped impatiently, armor creaked as soldiers shifted their weight, and commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. In the distance, the walls of Ramoth-Gilead stood as silent witness to the conflict that was about to determine its fate. The battle began with a thunderous clash of armies colliding, the sound of metal against metal mixing with the shouts of warriors and the cries of the wounded. Chariots raced across the battlefield like instruments of divine wrath, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that obscured vision and added to the chaos of combat. For a time, it seemed as though Ahab's strategy might succeed. Hidden among his soldiers, the disguised king fought with the desperation of a man who believed his life depended on remaining unrecognized. His years of military experience served him well, as he wielded sword and spear with deadly efficiency, contributing to the initial success of the Israelite forces. But the Syrian chariot commanders were not easily deceived. When they spotted King Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they immediately assumed they had found their primary target. A group of them converged on the king of Judah with deadly intent, their chariots cutting through the battle lines like ships through stormy seas. "Surely it is the king of Israel," they shouted to one another as they closed in on Jehoshaphat. The king of Judah found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, their occupants preparing to capture or kill what they believed to be their primary objective. In that moment of extreme danger, Jehoshaphat did what he had learned to do throughout his reign. He cried out to the Lord for deliverance. "Help me, O Lord," Jehoshaphat called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. What happened next was a clear demonstration of divine intervention. As Jehoshaphat's cry reached heaven, the Lord moved the hearts of the Syrian commanders in an unexpected way. Something about the king's appearance or manner suddenly convinced them that this was not their intended target after all. "It is not the king of Israel," one of them declared. And just as quickly as they had converged upon Jehoshaphat, they turned away to search for their real quarry elsewhere on the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the chaos of combat, King Ahab continued his desperate masquerade. His disguise had served him well throughout the morning, allowing him to participate in the battle without attracting the special attention of enemy forces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though human cunning might indeed triumph over divine decree. But the Lord's purposes are not thwarted by earthly schemes, no matter how cleverly conceived. As the battle raged on, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, not aiming at any particular target, but simply shooting into the mass of enemy forces. It was the kind of arrow that soldiers loose when they cannot see clearly through the dust and confusion of battle, hoping to strike something useful, but with no specific intent. The arrow flew through the air with the invisible guidance of divine providence. It passed over the heads of common soldiers, sailed between the wheels of racing chariots, and found its mark with the precision of perfect justice. The bronze point struck King Ahab between the joints of his armor, penetrating the one gap in his defenses that his disguise could not protect. The king felt the arrow's impact like a thunderbolt, the sudden, sharp pain followed by the warm spread of blood across his chest. He looked down in shock to see the Syrian arrow protruding from his body, its shaft trembling with the force of impact. In that instant, Ahab understood with perfect clarity that no amount of human cleverness could circumvent the word of the Lord. "I am wounded," the king cried out to his chariot driver, his voice tight with pain and the dawning realization of his doom. "Turn around and carry me out of the battle." The chariot driver, a loyal servant who had recognized his disguised king despite the common soldier's garb, immediately began maneuvering toward the edge of the battlefield. But extricating themselves from the chaos of combat proved more difficult than anticipated. The battle had intensified throughout the day, and enemy forces blocked many of the potential escape routes. As they struggled to retreat, King Ahab's condition continued to deteriorate. The arrow had found a vital spot, and blood flowed freely from the wound despite his attempts to stanch it. Yet with grim determination, the king remained propped up in his chariot, unwilling to let his army see him fall. His presence, even in his wounded state, was served to encourage the Israelite forces and maintain their fighting spirit. The battle raged from morning until evening, the outcome hanging in the balance as both sides fought with desperate intensity. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood spilled on the battlefield below, King Ahab's strength finally gave out. The disguised king, who had tried to outwit divine judgment, slumped forward in his chariot, his life ebbing away with each labored breath. As word of the king's condition spread through the ranks, the cry went up that would fulfill Micaiah's prophecy with devastating accuracy. Every man to his city and every man to his own country. The army of Israel, leaderless and demoralized, began to scatter across the hills just as the prophet had foreseen. Like sheep without a shepherd, they abandoned their positions and fled toward home, their dreams of victory dissolving into the nightmare of defeat. King Ahab died as the sun set over Ramoth-Gilead, his blood pooling in the bottom of his chariot. The man who had spent his reign choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths had finally encountered a reality that no amount of deception could alter. The word of the Lord, spoken through his faithful prophet, had been fulfilled to the letter.